I mean, this is like probably the 4th time I've tried to film this exact video. It's a really massive topic. There's so many angles, and I want it to be focused, and I want it to be like making a point about poetry and philosophy. We're gonna combine these two things in our minds, guys. My channel is all poetry and philosophy, and the reason that is because I think poetry is philosophy and should be considered philosophy. The pre-Socratics, the philosophers that came before Socrates, the first people we considered philosophers, they were poets. They were using poetry to serve inquiry, and they were using reasoning, and I think that's why we attribute the title of philosopher to them, because they were really the first rational thinking people that were documented, that weren't creating these dogmas or just myths to try to explain the world, but instead tried to use their reason. They were really the building blocks of philosophy before Socrates. They paved the way for Plato, for Aristotle, for everyone who came afterwards. And nowadays, you look at philosophy and you look at the essay structure and you look at the way that philosophy is delivered. It is no longer delivered through verse. I mean, everyone who I talk to about poetry agrees with me that it is very philosophical, but it isn't considered like a pure form of philosophy. Its purest form. It's the construction and extraction of arguments from text, from the form. It assumes that form can be separate from content, and in that sense, poetry is the farthest form of philosophy, you know what I mean? It's pretty difficult trying to reconcile the two nowadays. It's pretty difficult trying to argue for poetry as philosophy, but I think that argument needs to become the argument for form. One of my professors wrote a thesis that was brilliant, and she talks about how the essay, it was a constant development of form in philosophy, and it was trying to achieve very specific things, and it had opposition and criticism, and a bunch of people didn't agree with what it meant, but you know, more or enough people thought that it was doing something right, so they continued to use it, and it had something to do with being able to take the reader on the journey of rational thought and allow them to reason along with the author, but almost for like exactly the same reason, I think poetry is way more effective at this. I think that when you read someone like Nietzsche, it's much more easy to relate to what he's saying, to understand it, to feel it, and be convinced by it as a result, and then say Kant, who is making brilliant arguments, like, don't get me wrong, the delivery is lacking. You know, anybody who's tried to read a critique of pure reason, it just has folded their head over in their hands, almost weeping from how difficult it is to try to extract the ideas. And I think that is the basic flaw when we're thinking about philosophy, is we shouldn't be trying to extract ideas. The ideas should be presented eloquently to us. They should be almost self-evident whenever they're presented, because they should, you know, have reason behind them. They should have experience backing them up, but they should also have eloquency. I mean, I really don't see that that's a very high standard to set for philosophy, but I do see a lot of backlash whenever I try to bring this up from the academic philosophical community. I mean, for sure, philosophers aren't arguing that film, that podcasts, the purest form of discourse, may I add, like it is documented discourse, doing what Plato's dialogues attempted to do with the form of philosophy, but you know, creating that out of a reality, a real situation, a real conversation. Podcasts are incredible for philosophy, and there are so many good philosophical podcasts out there, guys. Like, I might do a video recommending some, but definitely just check some out. Like, go online, there's so many. I mean, what I mean to say is that poetry it receives a lot of hate in the philosophical community, because people assume that the link between reason and language necessarily equates to express what you have to say in a very dry way, and I don't think that that's personally the most effective way you can do it. I think by using the form that you're using is the best way to do philosophy. And I think one of the main kind of assumptions of the way of doing philosophy that is extracting arguments is that you can find truth and that language isn't fallible and that language can almost directly communicate what you want it to. But the reality is that language is fallible, that expression can't not get in the way of the point. So experimenting with how to express things and experimenting with form allows you to expand your mind, to expand the way that you think about things. Experimentation with forms, that's the way to achieve the kind of philosophy that I think philosophy is. Maybe not the kind of philosophy that the Anglo-American world thinks philosophy is. Even the act of creating poetry is a philosophical exercise. There was this essay I read, and she was a critic and a philosopher, and she read PreSocratic philosophy mainly, and she makes this brilliant point about how nowadays, in our contemporary view of what philosophy means and how philosophy is conducted, we think of the PreSocratics as having first thought of these things and second created poems out of them, necessarily detaching the form from the content. Whereas she makes a very good argument that why should we think that it didn't come just as naturally for them, especially because poetry, the poetry of Homer and great tragic ancient poets, they were the common media back in the day, and so one might argue that the media of today is this or the podcasts that I mentioned earlier. But why do we consider the pre-Socratics as having first thought of the ideas and second explicitly tried to apply them to the form, rather than thinking that is the natural form that those ideas could be expressed in? And that's how I feel about a lot of my poetry and a lot of my philosophy that I've discovered through my poetry. It is inseparable. You can only express as genuinely as you can express. That's basically it. And this is not to argue against the essay format entirely. I definitely have been much more against the essay than maybe I should be, because there are people who make the argument that the essay is an artistic format and it is a very malleable format, and I won't take that away. But the call to arms that I intend to fight for is to allow students of philosophy mainly and up-and-coming philosophers to express their ideas in whatever way they can, and for the philosophic community to be receptive to all of these different formats, for the philosophic community to take philosophical movies seriously, and to take poetry seriously as potential philosophy, to not accredit a philosophical idea mainly to the philosopher who wrote it out in an essay for people, as opposed to the poet. So I hope that I've been convincing. I hope that I've made a decent point for you. I hope that maybe you took something away from this, or you're able to look at poetry in a new light, especially philosophy in a new light. I wish that everybody can see philosophy as a really kind of, it's a malleable thing. You can do philosophy in whatever way you want to do philosophy, and it may not be at the moment considered the proper way to do philosophy, but hey, that's not how progress works, right? Let me know what you guys think down below. Let me know what your favorite philosophic poetry is. I would love some recommendations, so please leave recommendations down below for poetry that you've read that has expanded your mind. Leave your comments and ideas down below. I would love to hear them, and I will see you guys next time. I hope this has been decent and maybe won't turn out way too long for me to edit. I will see you around. Stay curious.